Okay, hey everybody, let's start again. Thanks for letting me know about my sound. Okay, so today's class is all about the simpler. The simpler is the Ableton sampler instrument. There are two samplers. We're going to get into sampler next week, which is big and confusing, and simpler is really streamlined and well designed. And useful. It's great not only for playing samples, but also for sound design generally, because it has a lot of features like the filter, LFO, Adsr envelope, pitch envelope. Lots of these things look like things that we've seen on our synths, like analog and wavetable and operator, that we've done classes on recently. So lots of kind of synthesizer-like sound design tools built onto a sampler. So I think that this is the most used and useful tool that I work with in Ableton, and you might be in the same boat. And so I just think that we should learn the tool that we use the most inside and out. So open up an Ableton file, create a simpler track on a MIDI track, and we're also going to have an audio track so that we can record. I'm going to record myself singing a note. La, la. Cool. You can work with any audio that you want to today. You can go to your samples and pull things. Try different kinds of material. I think we'll bop around too, but I want to start just with some kind of tone. So step one of the simpler is that you can drop any sample into this well. So I'm going to take this here, drag it straight in. That's my voice. We're going to spend a lot of time in classic mode first while we cover all of the features, do all the ins and outs, and then we'll talk about one-shot and slice mode. So I've dropped in a sample. The first thing that I want to do is crop it so that it starts at a good time. La, la. La, la. Cool. So these flags at the beginning and the end let you decide where the sound starts and where it stops. So why don't you take a moment and bring in some sample and move around the start point or the start point and the stop point and pick yourself some part of a sound to play. Okay, come on back. I hope you've got some good sound in there. So let's talk this through. We've got a gain, so we can change the volume on the front end. We also have volume on the back end, so that we can control, kind of do our gain staging inside of the simpler. You've got a start percentage, which is kind of like moving this line. If you turn it up, it's going to start later. What is the point of this? Well, check it out. You can't MIDI map where this is, but you can MIDI map the start point. So I'm going to show you here. To MIDI map, you just do Command M, click on the thing, turn a knob, Command M, and you're back. And I can change this with a knob to get some variation. A common use for this, I'll just do a quick detour, is on a hi-hat. So hi-hats, we're always trying to get some variation in them. This is really fatiguing to the ear because they're all exactly the same. But if you... there's a lot of things you can do to create subtle variations in them, and one of those is to vary the start point a little bit. So I'm going to play this. You could even put the LFO if you have Max for Live, get the LFO effect. This is what I would do. And map it to the start point, and then just make it really small so that it's just kind of oscillating across here. And maybe even just random, so we get different starting points. Cool, so we're getting now much more variety in our hi-hats. And it's even giving this cool kind of accent, random accent pattern, as sometimes we get louder parts of the sound and sometimes softer. So that's one thing you might use the start control for. Length determines the end portion, and it's also controllable by MIDI or automation in a way that this is not. So that's why it's a separate control. This is kind of like the gross tuning where you prune the original sample, and then these are changeable start and end points that you can modulate as part of your modulation of the sound. Cool. So let's talk about snap for a moment. When snap is on, watch how my start points, let's see, they are moving fairly smoothly, but not super smoothly. They're kind of jumping from spot to spot. Maybe this is more clear if I zoom in. Yeah. Okay, with it off, you slide very smoothly. When it's on, it does these bigger chunks because it is snapping the start point to a zero crossing. So zero crossings are really important features in a waveform. Ableton does a good job of helping us never really think about them while we're working, but I remember looking over the shoulder of the engineer who put together the first album that I was a part of that was my band's album in high school. We were a grunge jazz band called Graz. And the recording, all of the editing was full of pops. And the engineer had to zoom in on every edit point and start the edit point at a place where the waveform crosses zero. Because it turns out if you start a waveform off of zero, or basically if there's a discontinuity where it leaps from one position to another because you're doing an edit, then you get a pop. It's just part of the deal. So you're going to get less poppy start and end points if you let it choose zero crossings with snap on. But you get smoother control if you turn it off. So that is snap. I'm pretty sure that Ableton, whenever you have an audio file or something that loops, it's doing a teeny tiny crossfade at the beginning and the end so as to like glue the waveform together and not have a discontinuity that makes a pop. Okay, so let's talk about loop. So loop is how you could add an artificial sustain portion to your sound. Right now with it off, I play a note. And it plays the whole sample. This isn't quite like a synth where you have an attack portion, a decay to a sustaining level, and then you could hold the sustain part down as long as you want before releasing. So you can turn on loop to create an artificial sustaining portion. And you use a combination of length and loop and start. Well, start you want to keep if you want this to be the portion, but loop and length lets you, in a kind of confusing and unintuitive way, create a loop area. So the success of your loop area will depend on the size and shape of this window. I got lucky here. See here, we're leaping from a place where it's quiet to a place that it's loud, and so we get this pulsing. But if you make a small window of pretty self-similar stuff, if you make it really small, it's going to sound kind of artificial. So that's the dance that you're doing. A longer one is going to be less artificial, but it's going to have kind of lumpiness to it. But now we're sustaining in this portion. And then when we let go, the sound ends. So why don't you take the sample that you have and turn on loop and play with length and loop to find yourself some kind of passable sustain portion in the sound. And then try playing on your MIDI keyboard. You have to arm the track to play it. You can play on your MIDI keyboard, or you can turn on your typing keyboard, and this will make ASDF, etc. be your notes. So I'll give you a couple of moments to do this, and then we'll keep going. Okay, come on back. So voices is how many simultaneous notes can be played at once. You can do this to limit the amount of CPU that it's going to take. More polyphony is going to use more, well, if you actually use it, it uses more CPU. You can also decide that you want it to be monophonic, to be more like a bass or a lead. I'm just gonna mess with mine a little bit here. You You can also add fade on your loops, but I often find that gives it more lumpiness. Cool, so that's your choice for whether you want this to be a polyphonic synth or a monophonic. Cool, so let's talk about warp. So you hear I get some chipmunking here in my voice, right? You can turn on warp. Well, let's also think about how long these sounds are. So if I play a low note, it takes a long time. If I have warp off, I play a low note, it takes a long time. I play a high note, it's fast. When you turn warp on, just like when you're working on a clip, it decouples pitch from time. It lets you change the pitch independently of the duration, of the speed that the sample is playing. And it does this by some kind of stretching, using one of these flavors of stretching. So you can hear that beats is kind of crunchy because it's trying to preserve the transients so it doesn't take the punch out of drums, but it's kind of glitchy. Tones and texture each have their own flavor. For this and many things, complex is what's going to sound the best. And for voices, Complex Plex Pro is going to sound the best because it's going to correct for the chipmunk effect. So the quality of the sound is just much more consistent when you have warp mode turned on to Pro. So for each of these modes, you have a couple more controls here, just like you do on a clip. Texture, grain size, and flux. Texture, grain size, and flux. So your approach to warp modes could be try to choose the one that sounds the best, or it could be try to mess it up to get some interesting modulation. I could resample this and make it be a rhythmic pulse behind my track. So think of these as sound design tools as much as like just illusion creation station. Okay, so the next thing that I'm noticing about the sound that I have right now is that I really like starting not at the beginning. I don't want this whole kind of like weak mealy mouthed thing that I did here. I like the strong start that I get from starting later in the sound, but it's just kind of clicky and unnatural to start immediately in a sound like this. So we want to use this Adsr envelope to give the sound a little bit of a shape. So I can turn up the attack, and it'll soften. If I'm making a pad, maybe I turn up the attack a lot. So it takes 2 seconds to fade in. But for this sound, I think I just want to put a short one on so it's a little more naturalistic. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to play with warp modes, and you can play with these knobs. We'll go a little more into detail here. I realize this is review for a lot of my returning students, but you know what? It took me a number of times learning these things before they really sunk in, so hopefully this is helpful. for you as well. Cool, take a couple of minutes, warp modes, ADSR, and then we'll come back and look at this in more detail. Okay, let's take a deeper look at the ADSR envelope. And we can do that by clicking over here on Controls, or even popping out. Oh yeah, let's use this. So you can either pop out the waveform and see the controls on the bottom with this triangle, or you can click over on Controls and you'll get this deeper panel of options. So over here on the right, you have all of your envelopes, your two envelopes, your amplitude envelope and your pitch envelope. So an envelope is a changing value over time per note. I'm going to say that again. It's a changing value, which is to say like a changing shape of some parameter over time that is particular to a single note, that belongs to a single note, that is triggered by a single note. So this is the volume curve. Amplitude means volume. This is the volume curve of our note. And this picture is basically, you can see that as I move these things around, these knobs change. So this is just a representation of this. Attack is how long it takes to get to full volume. Decay is how long it takes to fall away to a sustaining volume. And then the release is how long it takes to go to zero volume after you let go of the key. So this adds a little tail. So right now I have a really fast attack and a fast decay. And so the sustain portion isn't a speed, it's a volume level. It's how much quieter is the sustain portion than the attack. So right now I have a fast attack and fast decay and a low sustain, which means that I get a big spike in volume at the beginning and then a quiet note. This is how you make sounds that sound like they were plucked. A higher sustain value is going to feel a little more like a bowed instrument or a wind instrument, something that doesn't have a real spike at the beginning. And then the release, I'm going to tell you when I let go, and it'll demonstrate. I'm playing, now I'm sustaining, now I let go. And it takes 6 seconds to fade away. So take a moment and get into the amplitude envelope of your sound and see what it's like with different values for attack, decay, sustain, release. And I recommend doing it in the control panel side so that you can visualize the shape. Okay, I'll give you a minute to do that and we'll come back. got a question on YouTube. He'd love to see a series on Serum. Yeah, maybe I'll do that at some point. I don't use Serum very much because I don't make a lot of like straight ahead EDM. There are lots of great tutorials online if you don't want to wait for me to make one. But people love it so much. At some point, I know I'm gonna get into it. Okay, come on back. Let's talk about more things that we can control here. So one is spread. This is something that we saw on synths. You can turn this up and it'll make a second copy of the sound and detune it. So right now, I don't know if you can hear that difference through streaming, but it's more chorusy, it's thicker. Yeah, it's thicker and it's got a little bit of warble to it. So this is gonna use twice as much CPU per note, as you can tell up to the right. I'm up to 15 for this C minor chord. I'm up to 26, 27 for it doubled. But it is a nice way to get some thickness into the sound. You can turn this up and get some random panning. This is a cool feature. I'm gonna I don't know, I think of random panning as really good for textures like this. Cool, I'm into that. Okay, and then velocity to volume. So this lets you control the amount that the velocity that you play the note, which is how hard you hit the keyboard, how much that affects the volume of the note. So when it's all the way up, it's super sensitive, and you get widely varying values. When it's 0, you get the same value all the time. So turning this down might be good for a sampler, for a sample like of a kick drum, where you don't want a whole lot of variation in it. And then maybe turning it up on something like hi-hats, where you would want more kind of expressive variation. Zach is noting that spread with Complex Pro is killing his CPU. Maybe a solution is turning it on, resampling it, and then putting it back in. Yes, that's a great idea. Just resample your sample with spread on, and then drop it into another simpler, and then you'll be playing with that spread sound. There's also other ways to get that spread. Well, there's other ways to thicken and fatten your sounds with audio effects. If you want a phasing effect like you get with the spread, you could use a phaser. That's going to use less CPU, I think, than running a second whole simpler, which is basically what spread's doing. It also gives you some width, which you can get other ways as well. There are stereo widener plugins. A good free one is called Wider. So there may be cheaper ways to get things, but Zach's idea of resampling the spread version, you could do that a couple of times and dropping it in would be awesome. Cool. So velocity to volume lets you decide how sensitive it is to velocity changes. And then there's just regular panning. So you can pan on the inside here. Okay. You also have on the amplitude envelope some different modes. So we could loop our envelope. I'm just holding down one note, and it's looping this shape every 100 milliseconds. That's cool. You can also loop it by metered rhythm. Sync means it's going to quantize this while it's playing to our tempo. And trigger is good for drums. It'll play the whole envelope, whether or not you lift the key before it's after. Okay, so that's your amplitude envelope. I'm going to give you a minute to play with this, play with any of these things that you found interesting. Try to get yourself a sound that you like and maybe a bit of MIDI that appeals to you. Cool, we'll loop back in a minute to talk about the pitch envelope. Okay, let's talk about the pitch envelope. So again, an envelope is a changing value over time, a shape over time that's attached to a single note. So here, that value is pitch, and we can our most important control here is amount. So this is telling you how many semitones, how many half steps this shape from top to bottom is going to represent. So now with 3 semitones, I'm going a minor third higher and then bending down to my pitch. So if you have any value for sustain other than 0, then your instrument's going to be out of tune, likely. So I suggest playing with the attack portion. Haha, to a lift up, and then the decay. Oh, 35 seconds to bend down. That's too much. So this is a way you can create a little bit more of a human articulation on these things. As we've talked about in past classes, drums. To model a drum, you need to have a kind of a big, really fast pitch envelope to go doo, doo. And that models the bending drum head as the stick is pushing it, as the stick is hitting it. This is also how you could do like sub bass doos, you know, or just like subtle flutters to the pitch. To me, this is kind of like a lo-fi sound. It's to make synths that have pitches that bend and warble a little bit like this. Yes. Cool. So why don't you play with pitch envelope? Well, I'll talk you through all the parts of it and then give you time. So here's where you can just transpose the bass note. So actually, since I sang a note and I don't know what it is, and I would like it to play a C when I play a C, this is what you need to change. So let's see. That's an E. Oh, that's a B when I play an E. So I gotta turn it up to there. Cool, so now my instrument is in tune. Fine-tuning the tuning can happen with detune. Also cool to map this to a knob for expressive purposes. Glide is going to give you a slide between the notes. It's great for monophonic instruments like a bass. Cool. All right, so that's everything here. Go ahead and play with the pitch envelope, play with your transpose, maybe try to pitch yours to match the real note that you're playing on the keyboard, and play with glide, detune, and this whole thing. We'll loop back in about 2 minutes. If you're not getting any effect of your pitch envelope, no matter what you set the timings to, make sure that amount is turned up. This is how big does how big a pitch change does the Y part of this graph represent. Okay, come on back. We have 2 more sections to get through here. So let's talk about the LFO. So to review, LFO stands for a low frequency oscillator. An oscillator is, it's related to an envelope. An envelope is a changing shape over time that is mapped to a single note. An oscillator is a changing value over time that repeats. It oscillates. So as always on LFOs, we have a couple of controls. We can change its speed with in absolute time with how many cycles per second in hertz, or we can map it to our tempo. I just realized I had my mic down. I'm going to go back and say this again about LFO. LFO is changing shape over time, just like a envelope is, but rather than being one shape over the whole note, it's a repeating shape. It stands for low frequency oscillator. So whenever we have an LFO in Ableton, we can change its speed either in how many cycles per second, which is hertz, or in metric time, 16th notes, triplets, quarter notes, half notes, etc. So this is an abstract shape, repeating shape. We can map it to different things. We can map it to volume. And now we have kind of a tremolo in eighth notes. Or we can do it subtly to volume with a smaller percentage. We can map it to pitch to give it vibrato. So I think a little bit of pitch vibrato, like turn it on until you can hear it and then cut it in half, is really nice for adding a little bit of subliminal humanity and motion to our sounds. We can also do panning if we want it to spin left and right in our ears. We can also have it connect to the filter. So we don't have anything set up here in the filter, but if we did, it's going to be basically turning on and off the filter as if there was a single knob that determined how much the filter is operating. it's turning that on and off. A couple more things about the LFO. There is an attack portion. So we can say, I only want it to kick in after a second and a half. This is really nice. I'm going to turn down the filter and turn up the pitch a little bit and make this faster. Nice. So here's a common use, which is to have vibrato kick in a little late. So here I have it mapped to pitch, so I'm doing vibrato like on a stringed instrument. And now it's going to be this expressive tail on the sound. You can also control it by key, which means that lower notes on your keyboard are going to have a different effect than higher notes. And you'll just have to experiment in your case to see what that means. One last thing here. So offset, you can just have it start in a different place if you have a setting where that's a meaningful distinction. And retrigger is going to get all of your notes synchronized in their oscillation. Like, let's say I have this shaking. If I play the notes at different times with retrigger on, they're going to be out of sync. And if I leave them on, if I leave retrigger off, then all of my notes, no matter when I start them, are going to have the same LFO shape, rather than having a separate start point for each of my notes. So take a minute and play with this. Play with extreme values first so that you can understand what's happening, and then dial in lower values to get something that gives your sound more motion inside of it. A common thing that distinguishes really good production from kind of boring production is that no sounds are static in really well produced music. Everything is evolving. Everything is in motion, even if it's some kind of motion inside of a static note. And giving yourself just a little bit of motion with an LFO is a way to get you those kind of next level sounds. Oh, notice you also have different LFO shapes. Saw waves, ramps, triangle, square, or pulse wave, and random. Okay, let's talk about the filter. So this is basically like an auto filter effect or an EQ8 node. It lets you cut certain frequencies. And you've got a couple of different shapes for the node. So this is a low pass or a high cut filter. This is a high pass or low cut filter. This is a band pass filter. And a notch. And this is a cool thing that lets you morph between a low pass and a high notch and a high pass filter. And it lets you morph through all of the filters. There's a band pass, there's your high pass, there's your notch. What's up, Jeremy? Nice to see you. We're working on Simpler today. Simpler is a sampler in Ableton. So for a long time when I was producing, I didn't think so much about filters. But now I think that you should filter everything that you work on. Every sound that you make, you should be thinking about which part of the frequency spectrum you want it to be using. So this steps a little backwards into our mixing class, but let's just take a look at my sound in the visualizer here. So there's all of this low stuff that's happening when I start my note. I can't hear that, my speaker can't play it, it's not useful. I want my drums to sound down there, not my voice. So I might want to filter there to cut out the low things that I don't need. So you could do that in here, or you could do it in EQ after. What makes this special is that it can be part of the expressiveness of the sound, the one that's built in here in Simpler. We saw a couple of reasons for that. One reason for that already, which was that we can modulate it with our LFO. So now we're not only changing the volume, but we're bringing this like from this position where nothing's happening to this over and over again. So you could imagine I want to do something more like a pad here, where I want a slow LFO and a lot of filter change. And now I have this evolving, sustaining sound. So we can do a couple of things more with this. So that's one way to use the filter in an expressive way. We can also do that by mapping the velocity of our notes to it. So this is actually going to change the cutoff frequency, meaning it's going to move this thing around based on how loud I play my note on my keyboard. So quieter notes get not only quieter, but they get darker because they get more of their highs filtered. And louder notes are not only louder, but they're brighter because the frequency is filtered higher. Key means how much does the lowness or the highness of the note change the filter. So if you have it set to 100, then it's going to actually be moving this filter around relative to the note that you're playing. If I just leave it in one place and don't have it move around, if I have key set down to 0, then notes that are down here are going to sound, and notes that are up here are not going to sound. Well, that's not what I expected. Let's see. Oh, I see. I had velocity up, so it was moving up as I was playing loud notes. So now this is truly fixed. High notes are getting all filtered out, and low notes are coming through. But if you turn up key to 100, then it'll move this around so that this is relative to the note that you're playing, not an absolute place. And I can get high notes that sound kind of muted, as well as I can get low notes that sound kind of muted. So it kind of balances it out depending on what note you're playing. Cool. The last thing to share with you here is the filter envelope. So just to review, an envelope is a changing value over time. It is a shape to the sound in some dimension. And it is a shape that is applied to an entire note, a single note. So this is the beginning of the note, this is the end of the note. And this map that we're seeing is the amount that the filter is happening. When it's down to 0, it is not being filtered at all. And when it's up, it is being filtered. Right now, nothing is changing because my amount is turned down. So just like the pitch envelope had a kind of scalar here, you turn it up and this takes effect. Same here. And so you can see with this all the way up that it's as I describe. So now we're getting this shape where it starts, it brightens, and then it darkens. So I guess this represents like the cutoff frequency. So we're starting bright, we're starting with it over here, and then bouncing down in the graph here. So this is how you can create some more shape to the sound, so that not only does it have a shape in its volume, but it has a shape in its filtering, which is to say it has a shape in its brightening and darkening over time. I'm going to flip this around with my morph knob for something more dramatic here, where with the envelope I'm cutting all the frequencies and then bringing that cutoff frequency down. So this is just another way that you can create motion inside the sound without creating motion in rhythm or in volume. It's just a way to create some flow internally in sounds and get yourself those kind of richer, next level, evolving, not static sounds. So I want to say thanks to everybody who came today. This was fun for me. I really enjoy these deep dives on the technical parts of Ableton. I also teach more creative classes where there's a lot more creative prompts and you working and making something cool on Tuesdays. And I do these technical classes on Thursdays. I'm going to start winding down for some summer schedule going on the Saturday studio classes for a little bit. There's no studio class this Saturday, but I just want to say welcome to anybody who's new. Thanks for coming by. I teach these regularly. I've taught a ton of them. They're all up on YouTube. You can follow me there. It's just YouTube/C/Elliot Cole. I believe there's a link down below here for you. And yeah, I do these on a donation basis. So if you want to keep the ball rolling and keep me doing these, you can send me a little bit of money. There's a PayPal link down below. I'd love to hear things that you make with this. If you have made a cool sound today, why don't you make a little something with it and upload it to the Discord server? There's a link on the Twitch page below on there as well. You can sign up for email updates on my website. There's a link below on Twitch for that. And yeah, I appreciate you coming by and making some music. If you want to do a fun activity this Sunday, you could come play flower pots with me. I'll paste a link here. I'm running a big group kind of happening where a couple hundred people are going to play flower pots in shifts all day long, playing a piece that I have written. And it's easy to learn. It would just take you an hour and a half. You'd spend an hour with us in a rehearsal Zoom room, and then we would do a 20-minute performance. And that's coming up on Sunday. Stay tuned for that. And yeah, follow me on the things. If you're on Twitch, hit the follow button above. YouTube, I'm really bad at social media kind of stuff, but I'm starting to figure out how I can make it work for me, and I think that it's going to work best if everybody just follows me on YouTube. That's where my classes are going to be. That's where all of the pieces that I write are going to be, if you want to keep up with my music. So I guess my social media ask of the moment is for everybody to jump over to YouTube and hit follow on my channel. Thanks so much for coming by. Keep in touch, and I will see you soon.